New York City has always been loud. Its streets hum with ambition, desperation, and the restless energy of millions chasing something more. But beneath that noise, hidden behind brick buildings and dimly lit social clubs, there existed a different kind of power, one that spoke softly, moved carefully, and rarely left fingerprints. This is where the story of Thomas Eboli begins, not with gunfire or headlines, but with restraint, patience, and an almost unsettling calm. Thomas Eboli did not rise through chaos. He rose through control, born into an era where survival often depended on loyalty and silence. Eboli learned early that the most dangerous men were not the loudest ones. In neighborhoods where violence was common and reputations were built on fear, he observed something others ignored. Fear attracts attention, but stability creates power. While many chased respect through brutality, Eboli focused on becoming indispensable, someone who could be trusted to keep things running when emotions threatened to tear everything apart. New York's underworld was never a single organization. It was a web of alliances, rivalries, favors, and grudges stretching across boroughs and generations. Within that web, Thomas Eboli became known as a steady hand, not because he avoided conflict, but because he understood timing. He knew when to speak, when to wait, and when silence carried more authority than threats. From the outside, his life appeared unremarkable. No flashy suits drawing attention. No reckless displays of power. He blended into the rhythm of the city, moving through it like just another man going about his business. But behind closed doors, his words carried weight. When disagreements arose, people listened. When tensions escalated, his presence lowered voices instead of raising them. This reputation did not come overnight. It was built slowly through consistency. Eboli believed that trust once broken could never be fully repaired. In a world where betrayal was common, that belief set him apart. Those who worked with him knew he valued loyalty above all else, not as a slogan, but as a principle that shaped every decision he made. Money flowed through New York's criminal economy like blood through veins. Gambling, labor rackets, underground loans. These were not random crimes but structured systems designed to generate steady income. Eboli understood that instability was bad for business. Violence invited law enforcement. Chaos attracted informants. Order, on the other hand, allowed operations to continue quietly for years. Instead of chasing dominance, he focused on balance. He acted as a bridge between powerful figures, easing tensions before they turned into open warfare. In many ways, his influence came not from commanding others, but from being the one everyone needed when things went wrong. That kind of power is invisible, but it is also incredibly rare. Yet even restraint has limits. The deeper Eboli moved into the underworld, the more complex his role became. Maintaining balance meant constantly navigating egos, greed, and ambition. One wrong decision could tip scales that had taken years to stabilize. Every conversation carried consequences. Every favor created a debt. And every debt, if left unpaid, could turn deadly. What made Thomas Eboli unique was his ability to think long-term in a world obsessed with immediate results. While others reacted emotionally, he calculated outcomes. He understood that survival was not about winning every battle, but about staying relevant long enough to matter. This mindset earned him respect from people who rarely respected anyone. Still, no one in that world is untouched by pressure. Law enforcement was changing. Investigations were becoming more sophisticated. Trust was harder to maintain as fear crept into conversations. Even the most disciplined men could not fully escape the tightening grip of consequence. Eboli sensed the shift before many others did, recognizing that the very systems he helped stabilize were becoming increasingly fragile. Despite this awareness, walking away was never simple. Power creates responsibility, and responsibility creates traps. The more dependable he became, the harder it was to step back. People relied on his judgment. His absence would create uncertainty, and uncertainty often leads to violence, the very thing he worked to prevent. This contradiction defined his life. He was a man seeking order in a world built on disorder, a figure who believed in control while operating inside chaos. And as New York continued to evolve, so did the pressures surrounding him. The story of Thomas Eboli is not a celebration of crime. It is a study of choices, how intelligence can be used for harm, how discipline can coexist with illegality, and how even the calmest minds cannot fully escape the consequences of the paths they choose. His rise reminds us that crime does not always look reckless. Sometimes it looks organized, calculated, and deceptively quiet. And that is what makes it dangerous. As the city moved forward, so did Eboli, carrying the weight of influence few could see and even fewer could understand. The steady hand that kept things balanced was now holding more responsibility than ever before, responsibility that would eventually demand a price. Power without accountability may feel control, but it always carries consequences. Intelligence and discipline can be used to build stability, or to justify staying on the wrong path longer than one should. In New York's hidden world, power was not announced, it was sensed. It moved through conversations held behind closed doors, through favors exchanged without paperwork, and through silences that carried more meaning than threats. For Thomas Eboli, understanding this language of power became essential. It was not enough to belong. One had to understand how influence truly worked. From the earliest stages of his rise, Thomas Eboli recognized something many overlooked. Crime was not sustained by violence alone. Violence was a tool, but rarely the most effective one. The real engine was structure. Rules spoken and unspoken governed everything. Who spoke first? Who mediated disputes? Who decided when a problem had grown too dangerous to ignore? These rules were learned slowly, often through observation rather than instruction. Eboli paid attention. While others rushed to prove themselves, he listened. He watched how senior figures carried themselves, how they avoided unnecessary attention, how they handled disagreements without raising their voices. He learned that impatience was a liability, and that those who demanded respect too loudly rarely held it for long. In rooms filled with ambition, he chose composure. Trust, he understood, was currency. But unlike money, it could not be earned quickly. It required consistency, showing up when expected, keeping promises, and never speaking more than necessary. Eboli built his reputation by doing exactly what he said he would do, no more and no less. This reliability made him valuable, especially in moments of uncertainty. New York's underworld was constantly shifting. Alliances formed and dissolved, fortunes rose and fell, and loyalty was tested daily. In this environment, people gravitated toward those who brought stability. Eboli's calm demeanor and measured decision-making positioned him as someone who could be relied upon when tensions threatened to spiral out of control. He learned how to negotiate without appearing weak. Compromise, when done correctly, was not surrender, it was strategy. By allowing others to feel heard, he often achieved outcomes that served his interests without creating enemies. This skill became one of his defining traits, separating him from those who relied solely on intimidation. Money flowed steadily through operations he became involved in, but wealth was never his primary display of success. He understood that excess invited scrutiny. Instead, he focused on sustainability, ensuring that systems ran smoothly, disputes were resolved quietly, and attention remained minimal. This approach kept law enforcement at a distance longer than brute force ever could. Yet the deeper he moved into this world, the more complex his responsibilities became. Managing relationships required constant awareness. A single misjudged comment could be interpreted as disrespect. A delayed response could be seen as weakness. Every action carried weight, and every decision rippled outward, affecting people far beyond the immediate situation. Eboli adapted by refining his instincts. He learned to read rooms quickly, sensing shifts in tone and intention. He noticed when conversations grew tense, when ambition edged toward recklessness, and when fear began influencing behavior. These observations allowed him to intervene early, preventing small disagreements from becoming violent confrontation. But power always comes with temptation. As his influence grew, so did the opportunities to push boundaries. There were moments when taking more money, more control, more visibility seemed within reach. Many around him succumbed to that temptation, driven by ego or impatience. Eboli resisted, knowing the restraint was the very reason he had advanced so far. Still, restraint did not mean detachment. He was deeply embedded in a system that rewarded loyalty to the group over morality. Decisions were justified as necessary, actions framed as business. Over time, the line between calculation and conscience blurred. This is how crime sustains itself, not through chaos, but through rationalization. Eboli's intelligence allowed him to thrive, but it also tied him tighter to a world that offered no clean exits. Each success reinforced his role. Each solved problem increased reliance on his judgment. And with reliance came expectation. People began to assume he would always be there to restore balance, to fix what others broke. That expectation became a burden. City outside continued to change. Law enforcement methods evolved. Surveillance improved. Informants became more common as fear replaced loyalty. The same discipline that once ensured safety now required constant adjustment. Eboli felt the pressure building, even if he rarely expressed it. In private moments, the weight of his position became clear. Maintaining control required vigilance without rest. One mistake could undo years of careful planning. One betrayal could expose networks built on trust. The calm exterior masked an existence defined by constant calculation. This chapter of his life illustrates a critical truth. Intelligence can elevate someone quickly, but it can also entrench them deeply. Eboli's ability to navigate power dynamics made him successful, but it also made him indispensable, trapped by the very skills that set him apart. Lesson: true power is often quiet, but quiet power still demands accountability. When intelligence is used to sustain wrongdoing, it does not free a person, it binds them more tightly to the consequences that follow. Influence is a subtle force. It does not arrive loudly or demand recognition. Instead, it settles quietly, growing heavier with time until its presence becomes impossible to ignore. For Thomas Eboli, influence was never something he chased openly. Yet it found him through consistency, discipline, and an ability to handle situations others could not. In New York's criminal landscape, influence mattered more than titles. Positions could be stripped away, alliances could shift, but influence once established reshaped how others behaved around you. People adjusted their tone, they listened more carefully, they considered consequences before acting. Eboli reached that point not by force, but by being dependable when unpredictability ruled everything else. The city's underworld functioned like a living organism. Every part depended on another. And when one area became unstable, the effects traveled quickly. Argument over money, territory, or pride had a way of spreading, pulling more people into conflict. Many conflicts began small and escalated because no one knew when to step in. That was where Eboli became essential. He was often called upon not to dominate a situation, but to cool it. His presence alone was enough to slow conversations down. People trusted that he would listen without rushing to judgment. He rarely took sides publicly, choosing instead to understand motivations before offering solutions. This approach earned him something far more valuable than fear: credibility. As his role expanded, so did his responsibilities. Managing influence meant maintaining balance between competing interests. Every decision required weighing short-term gains against long-term stability. A deal that benefited one group too much could alienate another. A compromise that appeared fair on the surface could create resentment beneath it. Eboli navigated these challenges carefully, aware that influence could disappear as quickly as it appeared if misused. Money remained central to everything. Profits fueled loyalty, but greed undermined it. Eboli understood that financial discipline was essential. He favored steady income over risky ventures that promised quick returns. This mindset protected operations from unnecessary exposure and kept people focused on sustainability rather than excess. Yet even disciplined systems faced pressure. Ambitions surrounded him. Younger figures sought recognition, eager to prove themselves. Older ones feared losing relevance. These tensions created an environment where impulsive decisions were always one step away. Eboli often found himself acting as a buffer, absorbing pressure so others wouldn't act recklessly. This constant mediation took a toll. Influence required emotional control, even when frustration mounted. He could not afford to react visibly or show uncertainty. Weakness, real or perceived, invited challenges. Maintaining composure became a daily discipline, practiced even in moments of private doubt. Despite his careful approach, influence came with expectations that were difficult to escape. People assumed he could fix anything. When problems arose, his name surfaced. When disagreements threatened to spiral, his involvement was requested. Over time, this reliance reduced his freedom. He could not simply step away without risking instability. Law enforcement presence increased as the city evolved. Investigations grew more sophisticated and trust within criminal circles weakened. Influence, once a shield, became a spotlight. The more central his role, the more attention it drew. Eboli became acutely aware that his calm efficiency, once an asset, also made him visible to those watching from the outside. Still, he continued forward. Walking away was not an option easily taken. Influence creates responsibility, and responsibility binds a person to outcomes beyond their control. Eboli's decisions now affected livelihoods, alliances, and lives. The weight of that influence pressed heavier with each passing year. He justified his position through logic. Stability, he believed, prevented greater harm. Order reduced chaos. His presence, he reasoned, kept violence contained. These justifications were common in that world, allowing individuals to view their roles as necessary rather than destructive. It was a mindset that eased conscience while tightening commitment. Yet no amount of reasoning could fully remove the consequences of influence built on illegality. Every decision carried risk, and those risks accumulated silently. The calm exterior masked a reality shaped by constant calculation and vigilance. Thomas Eboli's journey during this period highlights a crucial truth. Influence is not freedom, it is obligation. The more people depend on you, the fewer choices you truly have. Influence can elevate, but it also confines, shaping a life around expectations that cannot be ignored. Influence gained through wrongdoing is never neutral. Even when used to maintain order, it carries a cost that grows heavier with time. True stability comes not from controlling chaos, but from choosing paths that do not create it in the first place. Every system, no matter how carefully built, eventually faces moments that test its foundation. In the shadowed world where Thomas Eboli operated, those moments arrive quietly at first, through subtle changes in behavior, strained conversations, and an undercurrent of unease that could be felt even when nothing appeared wrong on the surface. Order was not accidental, it was maintained through constant effort. For Thomas Eboli, maintaining order meant understanding people as deeply as he understood operations. Numbers could be adjusted, deals could be revised, but human emotions were unpredictable. Pride, fear, greed, and insecurity shaped decisions more than logic ever could. Eboli learned that preventing conflict often depended on addressing these emotions before they erupted. He approached problems with patience. When tensions surfaced, he did not rush to confront them publicly. Instead, he gathered information quietly, listening to different perspectives without committing to one too early. This method allowed him to identify the real source of instability rather than reacting to its symptoms. In a world where overreaction often led to violence, restraint was a form of strength. Order also required boundaries. Eboli believed that clear expectations reduced misunderstandings. Those working around him knew where lines were drawn and what consequences followed when those lines were crossed. He did not enjoy enforcing discipline, but he understood that inconsistency invited chaos. Fairness, even when firm, earned respect. As his influence spread, the scale of challenges increased. Disputes were no longer isolated disagreements, but interconnected problems that affected multiple interests. A financial issue in one area could create resentment elsewhere. A personal rivalry could disrupt carefully balanced arrangements. Eboli found himself managing not just events, but the ripple effects that followed them. This responsibility demanded constant vigilance. He could not afford complacency. The environment around him changed rapidly, shaped by shifting loyalties and external pressures. He adapted by remaining observant, always aware that yesterday's solution might not work tomorrow. Law enforcement pressure intensified during this period. Investigations became more focused, and fear began influencing behavior within criminal circles. Trust weakened as people worried about exposure. Eboli recognized the danger this posed. Order depended on confidence, and fear eroded it quickly. To counter this, he emphasized discretion. Conversations became shorter. Information was shared on a need-to-know basis. He discouraged unnecessary meetings and reduced visible activity. These measures helped maintain stability, but they also increased isolation. The quieter things became, the heavier the silence felt. Despite these precautions, stress accumulated. Being the stabilizing force meant absorbing pressure from all sides. Others looked to Eboli for reassurance, expecting calm even when circumstances grew uncertain. He provided it outwardly, though privately he understood that no system built on secrecy was immune to collapse. Order, he realized, was fragile. It required constant maintenance and came at a personal cost. The more disciplined he became, the less room there was for error. Mistakes that once might have gone unnoticed now carried serious consequences. His role left little space for rest or reflection, yet he continued, driven by a sense of obligation. People relied on him not just for decisions, but for direction. Walking away would leave a vacuum, and vacuums invited disorder. This sense of responsibility bound him tighter to a life that demanded everything while offering no true security. In moments of quiet, Eboli reflected on the nature of control. He understood that, while he could manage situations, he could not control outcomes indefinitely. External forces, law enforcement, shifting alliances, and human unpredictability were always present. Control, he realized, was temporary by nature. This awareness did not free him. Instead, it sharpened his focus. He became even more deliberate, more cautious. Each action was measured not just for immediate effect, but for how it might be interpreted weeks or months later. His life became a series of calculated moves, each designed to preserve order a little longer. The paradox of his position was clear. The very skills that maintained stability also deepened his entanglement. Order within the shadows required sacrifice of freedom, peace of mind, and eventually safety. Eboli accepted this reality, believing that his role prevented worse outcomes. But no amount of discipline could change a fundamental truth. Order built on illegal foundations cannot last forever. It may endure longer than chaos, but its collapse, when it comes, is often sudden and unforgiving. Order achieved through control rather than integrity is fragile. True stability comes from choices that do not require constant defense or secrecy. When order depends on silence, its foundation is already weakening. Control is a powerful illusion. It convinces those who hold it that chaos can be contained, that outcomes can be shaped indefinitely through discipline and calculation. For Thomas Eboli, control was not just a strategy, it was a necessity. Yet the deeper he moved into positions of influence, the clearer it became that control was never absolute, only temporary. In the world he navigated, unpredictability was constant. People changed, circumstances shifted, external pressure grew without warning. Still, Thomas Eboli believed that careful planning could reduce risk. He trusted structure, timing, and restraint to keep situations manageable. For years, this belief appeared justified. He organized his affairs with precision. Financial arrangements were calculated conservatively. Relationships were maintained through balance rather than dominance. He avoided impulsive decisions, understanding that haste often led to exposure. This methodical approach created an appearance of stability, convincing many that he had mastered the complexities around him. But control requires constant attention. Every agreement depended on continued cooperation. Every promise relied on trust that could weaken under pressure. Eboli spent much of his time anticipating problems before they surfaced. He listened carefully for shifts in tone, subtle changes in behavior, and signs of ambition turning into recklessness. When he sensed danger, he intervened early, attempting to redirect outcomes before damage occurred. Despite these efforts, cracks began to form. The environment around him was changing faster than before. Law enforcement tactics evolved, becoming more strategic and persistent. Fear crept into conversations, altering how people behaved. Silence, once a sign of discipline, began to feel like anxiety. Control over people proved especially fragile. No matter how carefully relationships were managed, individual choices remained unpredictable. Greed tempted some to push boundaries. Fear drove others to distance themselves. Loyalty, once assumed, now required constant reinforcement. Eboli understood that control over systems was easier than control over human nature. Systems followed rules, people followed impulses. This realization forced him to adjust his approach, focusing more on minimizing damage than preventing it entirely. He accepted that not every problem could be solved cleanly. The burden of maintaining control grew heavier with time. Each decision carried greater consequences. Mistakes that once could be corrected quietly now threatened to expose entire networks. The margin for error narrowed, leaving little room for flexibility. Private moments. Eboli confronted a troubling truth. The sense of control he felt was sustained largely by momentum. Past successes created confidence, but they did not guarantee future safety. The systems he relied on worked only as long as everyone involved continued to act rationally, and rationality was never guaranteed. Still, stepping back was not simple. Control had become intertwined with identity. Letting go felt like inviting disorder, something he had spent years preventing. He justified continued involvement by believing that his presence reduced harm, that without his influence, chaos would escalate. This justification was comforting but incomplete. The longer he remained, the more he became a focal point. Control centralized around him, increasing both reliance and risk. Visibility grew quietly, not through public attention, but through importance. When too many outcomes depend on one individual, that individual becomes vulnerable. Eboli sensed this vulnerability. He adjusted routines, limited exposure, and reduced unnecessary interactions. These changes provided temporary relief, but they also underscored a deeper issue. Control was becoming reactive rather than proactive. Instead of shaping events, he was responding to pressures as they emerged. The illusion of control began to fade. What replaced it was vigilance, constant, exhausting vigilance. Every conversation required scrutiny. Every decision demanded careful timing. The mental cost of this vigilance was significant, though rarely acknowledged. Calm on the outside masked relentless calculation within. This phase of Eboli's life illustrates a universal lesson. Control achieved through influence and structure can delay consequences, but it cannot eliminate them. The belief that one can manage wrongdoing indefinitely is itself a form of risk, encouraging prolonged exposure rather than timely exit. Eboli's intelligence allowed him to navigate complexity longer than most. Yet intelligence alone could not change the fundamental nature of the path he had chosen. Control, no matter how skillfully maintained, remained fragile. Lesson: control built on illusion eventually demands a reckoning. True security comes not from managing risk endlessly, but from choosing paths that do not require constant defense. The longer one relies on control to justify wrongdoing, the heavier the consequences become. Control is a powerful illusion. It convinces those who hold it that chaos can be contained, that outcomes can be shaped indefinitely through discipline and calculation. For Thomas Eboli, control was not just a strategy, it was a necessity. Yet the deeper he moved into positions of influence, the clearer it became that control was never absolute, only temporary. In the world he navigated, unpredictability was constant. People changed. Circumstances shifted. External pressure grew without warning. Still, Thomas Eboli believed that careful planning could reduce risk. He trusted structure, timing, and restraint to keep situations manageable. For years, this belief appeared justified. He organized his affairs with precision. Financial arrangements were calculated conservatively. Relationships were maintained through balance rather than dominance. He avoided impulsive decisions, understanding that haste often led to exposure. This methodical approach created an appearance of stability, convincing many that he had mastered the complexities around him. But control requires constant attention. Every agreement depended on continued cooperation. Every promise relied on trust that could weaken under pressure. Eboli spent much of his time anticipating problems before they surfaced. He listened carefully for shifts in tone, subtle changes in behavior, and signs of ambition turning into recklessness. When he sensed danger, he intervened early, attempting to redirect outcomes before damage occurred. Despite these efforts, cracks began to form. The environment around him was changing faster than before. Law enforcement tactics evolved, becoming more strategic and persistent. Fear crept into conversations, altering how people behaved. Silence, once a sign of discipline, began to feel like anxiety. Control over people proved especially fragile. No matter how carefully relationships were managed, individual choices remained unpredictable. Greed tempted some to push boundaries. Fear drove others to distance themselves. Loyalty, once assumed, now required constant reinforcement. Eboli understood that control over systems was easier than control over human nature. Systems followed rules, people followed impulses. This realization forced him to adjust his approach, focusing more on minimizing damage than preventing it entirely. He accepted that not every problem could be solved cleanly. The burden of maintaining control grew heavier with time. Each decision carried greater consequences. Mistakes that once could be corrected quietly now threatened to expose entire networks. The margin for error narrowed, leaving little room for flexibility. In private moments, Eboli confronted a troubling truth. The sense of control he felt was sustained largely by momentum. Past successes created confidence, but but they did not guarantee future safety. The systems he relied on worked only as long as everyone involved continued to act rationally, and rationality was never guaranteed. Still, stepping back was not simple. Control had become intertwined with identity. Letting go felt like inviting disorder, something he had spent years preventing. He justified continued involvement by believing that his presence reduced harm, that without his influence, chaos would escalate. This justification was comforting but incomplete. The longer he remained, the more he became a focal point. Control centralized around him, increasing both reliance and risk. Visibility grew quietly, not through public attention but through importance. When too many outcomes depend on one individual, that individual becomes vulnerable. Eboli sensed this vulnerability. He adjusted routines, limited exposure, and reduced unnecessary interactions. These changes provided temporary relief, but they also underscored a deeper issue. Control was becoming reactive rather than proactive. Instead of shaping events, he was responding to pressures as they emerged. The illusion of control began to fade. What replaced it was vigilance, constant, exhausting vigilance. Every conversation required scrutiny. Every decision demanded careful timing. The mental cost of this vigilance was significant, though rarely acknowledged. Calm on the outside masked relentless calculation within. This phase of Eboli's life illustrates a universal lesson. Control achieved through influence and structure can delay consequences, but it cannot eliminate them. The belief that one can manage wrongdoing indefinitely is itself a form of risk, encouraging prolonged exposure rather than timely exit. Eboli's intelligence allowed him to navigate complexity longer than most. Yet intelligence alone could not change the fundamental nature of the path he had chosen. Control, no matter how skillfully maintained, remained fragile. Control built on illusion eventually demands a reckoning. True security comes not from managing risk endlessly, but from choosing paths that do not require constant defense. The longer one relies on control to justify wrongdoing, the heavier the consequences become. Pressure does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, settling into routines, altering habits, and reshaping decisions without ever raising its voice. For Thomas Eboli, pressure became a constant companion, present in every calculation, every pause, every moment of silence that followed a conversation. In environments built on secrecy, pressure rarely comes from a single source. It accumulates from many directions at once. Expectations from associates, shifting loyalties, financial responsibility, and the ever-present awareness of law enforcement all converged. Thomas Eboli understood that pressure, if ignored, had the power to fracture even the most carefully managed systems. He responded by becoming more controlled, not less. Daily routines grew more deliberate. Movements were planned with greater care. Communication became minimal and purposeful. He avoided unnecessary exposure, preferring distance over familiarity. These adjustments were subtle, almost invisible to outsiders, but they reflected a deeper change. Pressure was shaping behavior. One of the most difficult aspects of this period was managing the expectations placed upon him. People still saw him as a stabilizing force, someone capable of resolving problems that seemed unsolvable. They brought him disputes, uncertainties, and risks, trusting his judgment without fully understanding the weight it carried. Saying no was not always an option. Refusing involvement could be interpreted as weakness or disloyalty. Accepting involvement meant absorbing responsibility for outcomes he could not fully control. Each choice carried consequences, and the margin for safe decisions narrowed. Pressure also altered relationships. Conversations that once felt straightforward now carried subtext. Trust, though still present, felt fragile. People spoke carefully, measuring words as if they might later be repeated. Silence grew heavier, no longer simply a sign of discipline but a reflection of caution. Eboli adapted by sharpening his instincts. He paid closer attention to tone, timing, and behavior. Small changes mattered. A delayed response, a shift in posture, an avoided topic, these details signaled deeper issues. His ability to read these signals allowed him to anticipate problems, but it also required constant focus. This vigilance was exhausting. Pressure without release has a way of reshaping perspective. Successes no longer brought satisfaction, they brought relief. Each resolved issue felt less like an achievement and more like a temporary escape. Stability was no longer celebrated, it was merely maintained. Despite this strain, Eboli remained composed. Those around him saw calm, not fatigue. He understood that visible stress invited speculation. Control of emotion became as important as control of operations. Even when uncertainty grew, he presented certainty. Yet inwardly he recognized a troubling pattern. Pressure was no longer episodic, it was permanent. The environment had changed in ways that discipline alone could not fully counter. Law enforcement pressure intensified quietly, methodically. Investigations stretched longer, digging deeper. Fear influenced decisions, sometimes more than loyalty or logic. This shift increased the risk of unpredictable behavior. Pressure made people desperate, and desperation led to mistakes. Eboli found himself spending more time preventing others' errors than advancing his own interests. The role of stabilizer had evolved into that of damage controller. Financial pressures added another layer. Maintaining steady income required careful balancing. Too much caution slowed progress. Too much ambition increased exposure. Every adjustment required consideration of how it might ripple outward, affecting others who depended on consistency. Pressure also tested resolve. There were moments when stepping away seemed appealing when the cost of continued involvement outweighed its benefits, but disengagement carried its own risks. Absence could create uncertainty, and uncertainty often led to conflict. Eboli understood that his presence, however burdensome, still provided structure. This realization trapped him in a familiar paradox. Staying meant enduring pressure, leaving meant inviting chaos. Neither option offered peace. As time passed, pressure reshaped his understanding of power. He saw clearly that power did not free a person from stress, it concentrated it. The higher one rose, the more weight settled on their shoulders. Influence brought responsibility, and responsibility brought vulnerability. Eboli's experience during this period underscores an important lesson. Pressure thrives in environments built on secrecy and control. It grows quietly, feeding on feared expectation. Those who believe they can manage it indefinitely often underestimate its cumulative effect. Despite his intelligence and discipline, Eboli was not immune. Pressure changed how he viewed the future, making long-term planning more cautious and short-term decisions more defensive. The steady confidence that once defined him became guarded optimism. Still, he persisted. He believed that endurance was part of responsibility, that managing pressure even silently was preferable to abandoning structure altogether. This belief sustained him, but it also delayed reckoning. Pressure that is ignored does not disappear, it accumulates. True strength is not measured by how long one can endure silent pressure, but by recognizing when a path demands more than it can ever give back. Trust is fragile in any environment, but in a world built on secrecy, it becomes both essential and dangerous. It binds people together, yet it also creates vulnerability. For Thomas Eboli, trust had always been the foundation of his influence. But as pressure intensified, that foundation began to strain in ways that could not be ignored. Trust once flowed naturally through consistent behavior. People believed in Eboli's judgment because he delivered stability. He kept his word, avoided unnecessary conflict, and acted with restraint. Over time, this reliability became his signature. But trust is not static, it must survive changing conditions, and those conditions were shifting rapidly. Fear altered behavior. People who once spoke freely now chose words carefully. Meetings became shorter. Assurances felt rehearsed. Even long-standing relationships carried an undercurrent of caution. Thomas Eboli noticed these changes immediately. He understood that fear did not always signal betrayal, but it often preceded it. Maintaining trust under strain required more effort than building it initially. Eboli found himself reinforcing relationships that once felt secure. He offered reassurance without overexposure, attempting to preserve confidence without drawing attention. This balance was difficult. Too much reassurance could appear defensive, too little could be interpreted as detachment. Trust also demanded boundaries. Information became compartmentalized. Not everyone needed to know everything, and Eboli ensured that sensitive details remained limited. This approach reduced risk but introduced distance. Distance, while protective, weakened the sense of unity that trust depends upon. He faced another challenge: differing perceptions of loyalty. Some believed loyalty meant unwavering commitment regardless of risk. Others saw loyalty as self-preservation first. These conflicting views created tension. Eboli navigated this divide carefully, understanding that enforcing loyalty through pressure often backfired. The strain revealed itself in subtle ways: delayed responses, missed signals, minor misunderstandings that lingered longer than they should have. Each instance required attention, because unresolved doubt had a way of growing quietly. Eboli addressed issues early when possible, preferring clarification over assumption. Despite these efforts, trust continued to erode in small increments. External pressure made people cautious, and caution reduced openness. The very discretion that once ensured safety now limited communication. This paradox made trust harder to sustain. Eboli responded by leaning on consistency. He did not change his demeanor or habits abruptly. Predictability, he believed, created reassurance. When people know what to expect, they feel safer even in uncertain environments. This strategy helped maintain service level stability, but it could not fully restore confidence. Internally, he recognized a difficult truth. Trust could not be demanded or repaired on command. It depended on collective belief, and belief weakened under fear. The systems he had relied upon were still functioning, but their margins were thinner. Trust also placed Eboli in a vulnerable position. Being trusted meant being central. Being central meant being exposed. As others grew more cautious, reliance on him increased. People looked to him for guidance, assuming his judgment would protect them. This expectation added weight to every decision. The burden of trust was heavy, because failure would not be personal, it would be collective. A misstep could affect many, amplifying consequences. Eboli felt this responsibility deeply. It influenced his choices, making him more conservative, more deliberate. Yet, even with careful management, trust could not be insulated from reality. External forces continued applying pressure, and internal doubts grew alongside them. Eboli observed how fear reshaped priorities, how self-interest sometimes overshadowed shared goals. These observations did not surprise him, but they disappointed him. He understood that trust built within a criminal system was inherently unstable. It relied on mutual benefit rather than shared values. When benefit diminished or risk increased, trust weakened. This was not a moral judgment, it was an operational reality. Still, Eboli worked to preserve what remained. He believed that maintaining trust, even imperfectly, reduced chaos. Without it, misunderstandings would escalate, and stability would fracture. His efforts were not about idealism, they were about minimizing harm. This phase of his life illustrates the cost of relying on trust where fear dominates. Trust becomes transactional, conditional, and fragile. It requires constant reinforcement and offers no guarantees. Trust sustained by fear is always temporary. When loyalty depends on circumstances rather than values, it weakens under pressure. True trust grows from integrity, not necessity, and without integrity, it will always strain under stress. Silence can be protective, but it can also be deceptive. In environments shaped by secrecy, silence is often mistaken for control. For a long time, Thomas Eboli believed that limiting words reduced risk. Fewer conversations meant fewer misunderstandings. Less exposure meant fewer consequences. But over time, silence began to change its meaning. What once felt like discipline slowly became isolation. In the world surrounding Thomas Eboli, silence had always been a tool. It kept information contained and emotions restrained. Yet as pressure increased, silence started to hide problems rather than prevent them. Issues that might once have been discussed openly were now avoided entirely. This shift created blind spots. Eboli noticed that fewer people brought concerns forward, not because problems had disappeared, but because fear discouraged conversation. Silence masked uncertainty, and uncertainty fed mistakes. When people stopped talking, they started assuming, and assumptions are rarely accurate. He adjusted by becoming more observant. Since words were limited, behavior became more important. He watched how people carried themselves, how quickly they responded, how often they avoided eye contact. These small details told stories that silence concealed. His ability to read these signs helped him stay ahead, but it also revealed how fragile communication had become. Silence also changed relationships. Familiarity gave way to formality. Conversations felt transactional, stripped of openness. Even long-standing associations felt distant. Eboli understood that while silence reduced exposure, it also weakened connection. Without connection, coordination suffered. The danger of silence was subtle. It did not create immediate chaos. Instead, it delayed responses. Problems lingered longer. Misunderstandings went unresolved. Minor issues accumulated until they demanded attention all at once. By the time silence broke, the situation was often more severe. Eboli faced a difficult balance. Encouraging communication increased risk, but discouraging it invited error. He chose a measured approach, allowing dialogue when necessary while maintaining strict boundaries. Still, the environment had changed. Silence had become less about discipline and more about fear. Fear reshaped priorities. People focused on self-protection, sometimes at the expense of collective stability. Silence made it easier to distance oneself emotionally. This distancing reduced accountability. When no one speaks, responsibility becomes blurred. Eboli recognized that silence also affected him personally. Without feedback, decision-making became more isolated. He relied increasingly on his own judgment, aware that fewer perspectives meant greater risk of oversight. The role that once involved coordination now felt solitary. This isolation weighed heavily. Leadership, even informal, depends on communication. Silence stripped leadership of its support system, leaving only responsibility behind. Eboli felt the strain of making decisions without the reassurance that came from shared understanding. Externally, pressure continued to build. Investigations advanced quietly, mirroring the silence within the underworld itself. The lack of conversation made it harder to assess risk accurately. Information arrived late or incomplete. By the time warnings surfaced, options were limited. Eboli adapted by planning contingencies. He assumed worst-case scenarios more often, preparing for outcomes he hoped to avoid. This defensive posture protected him in the short term, but it also narrowed possibilities. Decisions became about survival rather than progress. Silence changed the emotional landscape as well. Anxiety replaced confidence. Calm was maintained outwardly, but beneath it lay constant vigilance. The absence of open dialogue intensified internal pressure. Thoughts that might once have been shared now remained unspoken, increased mental strain. This period revealed a critical insight. Silence, while useful, cannot replace trust. When silence becomes the default, it signals erosion rather than strength. Systems depend on communication to adapt. Without it, they become rigid, and rigidity breaks under stress. Eboli began to see silence not just as a protective measure, but as a warning sign. It indicated fear, distance, and fragility. The very tool he once relied on was now undermining stability. Yet changing course was difficult. Reintroducing openness risked exposure. Remaining silent risked collapse. Eboli navigated this dilemma cautiously, aware that neither option offered safety. This stage of his journey underscores a vital lesson. Silence can shield, but it can also isolate. When silence replaces communication entirely, it becomes dangerous not because of what is said, but because of what remains unspoken. Silence may reduce noise, but it cannot solve problems alone. When fear silences communication, risk multiplies unseen. True stability requires honest exchange, not just quiet control. Stability rarely collapses all at once. More often, it fractures quietly, forming cracks beneath a surface that still appears intact. For Thomas Eboli, this stage of his life was defined not by sudden chaos, but by subtle shifts that signaled deeper trouble ahead. Outwardly, things still functioned. Operations continued. Conversations happened when necessary. The structure he had helped maintain remained standing, but beneath that structure, tension grew. Decisions felt heavier. Outcomes felt less predictable. The confidence that once guided judgment now required constant reinforcement. The cracks appeared first in timing. Responses that once came quickly were delayed. Meetings were postponed or shortened. Small inefficiencies emerged where precision once ruled. None of these issues alone signaled collapse, but together they suggested erosion. Thomas Eboli recognized these patterns as warning signs. Cracks also formed in expectation. People began hedging their commitments, leaving room for uncertainty. Assurances sounded conditional. Loyalty felt cautious rather than firm. Eboli understood that this behavior was rooted in fear, not malice. Still, fear had consequences. He addressed these shifts methodically. He clarified expectations without confrontation. He reinforced consistency through action rather than words. His approach remained calm, but internally he recognized that maintaining stability was becoming more difficult. One of the most dangerous aspects of this phase was complacency. Because collapse had not yet occurred, it was tempting to believe it wouldn't. Eboli resisted that temptation. He knew that systems often fail not because warnings are absent, but because they are ignored. Yet awareness alone could not stop erosion. External pressure continued its quiet advance. Investigations grew more persistent. Surveillance became more precise. Fear increased, tightening the cracks already present. People became more guarded, more inward-focused. The collective mindset shifted from cooperation to preservation. Eboli found himself managing not just operations but emotions. Anxiety affected judgment. Stress shortened patience. These human factors introduced volatility into an environment that depended on restraint. He intervened where possible, but intervention itself carried risk. Cracks also appeared within Eboli himself. Years of vigilance had taken their toll. Decisions that once felt natural now required more deliberation. He double-checked assumptions, aware that a single oversight could have far-reaching consequences. This caution was necessary, but it slowed momentum. Isolation intensified. With fewer open conversations, he carried more responsibility alone. Leadership without dialogue became burdensome. The absence of shared understanding increased the mental weight of each choice. Despite these challenges, Eboli maintained composure. Those around him saw steadiness, not strain. He believed that visible uncertainty would worsen instability. Calm became both a shield and a performance, one he sustained even as pressure mounted. Cracks are dangerous because they invite denial. As long as structures remain standing, it is easy to dismiss early signs of failure. Eboli did not deny their existence, but he underestimated how quickly they could widen. Financial pressures added to the strain. Maintaining balance required careful adjustments. Too much caution risked stagnation. Too much aggression risked exposure. Each decision narrowed the path forward, reducing options over time. He began to consider contingency more seriously. What if systems failed? What if stability could no longer be preserved? These thoughts were uncomfortable but unavoidable. Planning for breakdown felt like admitting defeat, yet ignoring the possibility felt irresponsible. Cracks also affected trust. Doubt crept into relationships, making coordination more difficult. Even when intentions aligned, uncertainty distorted perception. The erosion did not produce immediate conflict, but it weakened cohesion. Eboli's experience during this period highlights an essential truth. Stability is not permanent. It must be reinforced continually, and even then, it remains vulnerable. Cracks do not mean failure is inevitable, but they demand attention and humility. As pressure increased, Eboli faced a narrowing set of choices. Maintaining the status quo required more effort with diminishing returns. Adjusting course carried risk. Every option involved sacrifice. Still, he continued forward, guided by discipline and experience. He believed that careful management could still prevent collapse. Whether that belief was realistic or hopeful remained uncertain. Cracks ignored do not heal, they widen. Stability requires constant honesty about its weaknesses. When warning signs appear, the courage to reassess matters more than the desire to preserve appearances. There comes a point in every long journey where the road begins to narrow. Options that once felt open slowly close, not because of a single mistake, but because time, pressure, and consequence converge. For Thomas Eboli, this period was defined by that narrowing path of realization that flexibility was fading and that every step forward required greater precision than ever before. The environment around him had grown less forgiving. Decisions that once allowed room for adjustment now demanded accuracy. Small errors carried disproportionate risk. The margin that had protected him for years was thinning, and he knew it. For Thomas Eboli, adaptation had always been a strength. He adjusted methods, refined routines, and rebalanced relationships as circumstances changed. But adaptation requires space, and space was becoming scarce. External pressure compressed timelines, while internal caution slowed movement. The result was a constant tension between action and restraint. He became increasingly selective. Not every opportunity was worth pursuing. Not every problem required immediate involvement. Choosing what to ignore became as important as choosing what to address. This selectivity reduced exposure, but it also reduced influence. The more he stepped back, the more others filled gaps in unpredictable ways. The narrowing path was evident in conversations. Discussions focused less on growth and more on containment. Planning shifted from expansion to preservation. The language of ambition gave way to the language of survival. These changes were subtle but unmistakable. Eboli understood that survival, while necessary, could not be a permanent strategy. Systems designed only to endure eventually stagnate. Yet pushing forward carried risk he could not ignore. Each decision felt like choosing between two imperfect outcomes. Relationship also reflected the narrowing path. Trust still existed, but it was cautious. Commitments were carefully worded. People sought reassurance without offering vulnerability. Eboli recognized that fear had reshaped priorities, making cooperation more conditional. He responded by emphasizing clarity. When he spoke, he was direct. Ambiguity invited misunderstanding, and misunderstanding invited conflict. His words were measured, purposeful, and minimal. Silence remained a tool, but clarity became essential when silence ended. The mental toll of this phase was significant. Constant evaluation drained energy. The need to anticipate multiple outcomes created fatigue. Even rest felt temporary, overshadowed by awareness of unresolved risks. Yet outwardly he remained composed, knowing that visible strain would erode confidence further. Financial considerations tightened the path even more. Maintaining balance required careful calibration. Income streams had to remain steady without drawing attention. Adjustments had to be subtle. Each financial decision was weighed not just for profit but for visibility. Eboli's experience revealed a critical reality: time changes risk. What was once manageable becomes dangerous simply because circumstances evolve. Success does not freeze conditions, it attracts scrutiny. Longevity itself becomes a factor in exposure. He began to recognize patterns he had seen before in others. The narrowing of options, the shift from control to reaction, the quiet realization that the future held fewer choices than the past. These patterns were familiar, yet confronting them personally carried a different weight. Despite this awareness, Eboli did not panic. Panic leads to mistakes. He relied on discipline, trusting that careful movement could still preserve stability. He avoided drastic changes, understanding that sudden shifts attracted attention. Yet discipline could not restore lost flexibility. The path remained narrow, and every step required caution. The sense of inevitability, never spoken, rarely acknowledged, hung quietly in the background. This phase underscored a sobering truth. The longer one operates within risk, the fewer exits remain. Even intelligence and restraint cannot create options indefinitely. Eventually, choices become constrained by history. Eboli faced this reality with quiet resolve. He continued forward, not out of denial, but out of responsibility. People still relied on his judgment. Systems still depended on his steadiness. Walking away without preparation could accelerate collapse. The narrowing path was not yet an ending, but it was a warning, a reminder that control has limits, and that time is not neutral. It shapes outcomes whether acknowledged or not. When choices begin to narrow, reflection becomes essential. Persistence without reassessment can lead to entrapment. True wisdom lies in recognizing when a path is closing and having the courage to seek a better one before it disappears. Silence, once a shield, can become a chain. For Thomas Eboli, the very tool that had protected him for years was beginning to exact a toll he could no longer ignore. In the shadows where he operated, the absence of words had long been a sign of discipline, a method to prevent mistakes, and a way to control exposure. But over time, silence revealed a more dangerous side. It isolated, it concealed, and it amplified pressure. Eboli had always understood the value of measured speech. In a world filled with unpredictable personalities and fragile alliances, saying too much invited trouble. Words could be misinterpreted, repeated, or weaponized. By saying less, he controlled the flow of information, maintaining influence without drawing unnecessary attention. For years, this strategy worked. But now, silence carried consequences that were harder to manage. People began filling the void with assumptions. Without direct communication, uncertainty spread like a silent current. Associates speculated about intentions, misread motives, and adjusted behavior based on what they feared rather than what was real. Trust, already fragile, started to weaken. Relationships that had once been reliable now carried unspoken tension. Eboli recognized this immediately. He understood that unchecked assumptions are more dangerous than confrontation. Misunderstandings that could have been addressed early were now festering quietly. Small errors compounded into problems that demanded careful attention before they escalated. The isolation imposed by silence was also personal. Eboli increasingly relied on his own judgment, making decisions without the reassurance of open dialogue. Leadership without feedback is a heavy burden, and he felt that weight in every choice. Even minor miscalculations carried amplified consequences. Financial decisions were not immune. Maintaining operations required precision, timing, and coordination. Silence limited oversight and feedback, increasing the risk of errors. Small missteps in accounting or resource allocation could have cascading effects, threatening stability he had built over years. The environment outside added pressure. Law enforcement, surveillance, investigative techniques, and external scrutiny were intensifying. Silence reduced exposure but also reduced awareness. Eboli understood that being uninformed about subtle shifts could leave him unprepared for threats, even as he remained outwardly composed. Cracks in trust and communication also affected his team. People became more cautious, more inward-focused. Decisions became guarded and collaboration slowed. Even loyal associates acted with a degree of reservation that eroded operational efficiency. The very structures Eboli had built to sustain order now required constant repair. He responded by increasing vigilance. Observation replaced conversation. Body language, timing, and reactions became the primary sources of information. Every interaction was analyzed, every nuance considered, yet vigilance, while protective, added mental strain. Continuous monitoring leaves little space for rest, and over time, fatigue amplifies risk. Silence also influenced perception. To outsiders, calm and minimal speech suggested mastery. But internally, Eboli knew it masked the cumulative pressure of unspoken concerns. The outward appearance of control could not fully hide the tension building beneath the surface. This stage of his life revealed an uncomfortable truth. Tools that protect in one context can become liabilities in another. Silence, while reducing exposure, also limited adaptability. Without open channels, problems cannot be fully addressed before they escalate. And in a world defined by unpredictability, escalation can have severe consequences. Eboli's approach evolved. He began selectively breaking silence, introducing clarity where assumptions threatened stability. Carefully timed words replaced absence. Direct communication mitigated risk without overexposure. This balance was delicate but necessary. Silence remained a tool, but it was no longer the default. He also recognized the psychological cost. Years of restraint, vigilance, and self-reliance weighed heavily on him. Decision that once flowed naturally now required deliberate calculation. Mental fatigue became constant, yet outward composure had to be maintained. Any sign of weakness would destabilize both perception and influence. The cost of silence extended beyond operation. It shaped his worldview, reinforcing caution and reducing flexibility. Adaptability, once a hallmark of his strategy, was now constrained by accumulated pressure and limited channels of feedback. Each choice became a negotiation between safety and necessity, between caution and progress. Yet Eboli persisted. He understood that retreat was not an option. Systems relied on his judgment. Stability depended on his presence, and those who trusted him expected guidance. The burden of responsibility demanded endurance, even as the tools that had served him began to exact their price. This period of his life offers an enduring lesson about the interplay of strategy and consequence. Measures that provide protection may also create hidden costs. Long-term effectiveness depends not just on initial success, but on continuous assessment, adjustment, and awareness of evolving risks. Silence protects only temporarily. When overused, it isolates, obscures, and amplifies pressure. True leadership and stability require openness at the right moments, clarity in communication, and awareness that unspoken risks grow silently beneath the surface. Ambition can be a double-edged sword. It drives achievement, demands excellence, and creates influence, but it also attracts attention, fuels rivalry, and exposes vulnerability. For Thomas Eboli, ambition had always been a quiet force, guiding decisions without fanfare. Yet as his position solidified, he realized that even subtle ambition casts shadows, and those shadows often conceal danger. Eboli understood ambition better than most. It was not the brash, impulsive kind that seeks recognition through bold acts. It was measured, disciplined, and patient. He observed others rushing to prove themselves, chasing visibility at the expense of caution. In contrast, he relied on steady accumulation of influence, building networks quietly while keeping exposure minimal. This approach earned respect without creating enemies unnecessarily. Yet ambition was contagious. People around him were not immune. Associates began seeking prominence, asserting authority and testing boundaries. Their ambition was often untempered by experience or foresight. While he had risen through careful planning, they relied on instinct, ego, and occasional recklessness. Managing their drive became as crucial as managing operations. Eboli's skill lay in channeling ambition rather than confronting it directly. He allowed initiative when it served the larger system and curtailed it when it threatened balance. This method required constant vigilance. Recognizing potential risks in early stages of ambition allowed him to intervene discreetly before errors escalated. Financial power, too, reflected the influence of ambition. Profits were not just a metric of success, they were incentives, tools, and signals. How money was handled influenced behavior, loyalty, and trust. Eboli ensured that rewards were measured, distributing resources in ways that encouraged cooperation rather than competition. Yet even with careful management, the hunger for advancement created tension. The shadows of ambition extended beyond individuals. Rival factions observed success closely, interpreting restraint as weakness or delayed action as opportunity. Competitors were not just enemies, they were mirrors reflecting his own potential vulnerabilities. Every move he made was scrutinized, every absence noted. Ambition, when left unchecked, invited challenge. Eboli's response was strategic. He relied on timing, ensuring that actions coincided with maximum effect and minimal risk. Opportunities were seized carefully, decisions made with foresight. He understood that visibility, while sometimes necessary, carried inherent danger. Too much attention invited scrutiny, too little invited doubt. Finding the balance became increasingly critical. Personal ambition had consequences as well. Eboli had to reconcile his desire to maintain influence with the reality of constant pressure. The higher he rose, the more dependent others became on his judgment. Every choice carried weight far beyond immediate outcomes. Responsibility expanded alongside opportunity, and the margin for error contracted. Yet ambition also inspired caution. Recognizing the stakes involved tempered decisions, transforming instinctive reactions into calculated measures. He learned that sometimes restraint was more powerful than action, and patience more valuable than recognition. Discipline became the bridge between success and exposure. Cracks occasionally appeared. Ambitious associates occasionally challenged directives, pursued personal gain, or acted independently. These moments were subtle but significant, requiring careful assessment. Eboli addressed them with discretion, correcting course without confrontation whenever possible. The objective was to maintain cohesion while discouraging disruption. At the same time, ambition was not entirely external. Eboli felt the weight of his own expectations. The systems he managed relied on him for stability, success, and foresight. Stepping back was rarely an option. Ambition was not just about accumulation. It was about preservation, maintaining the order he had created while navigating an environment that grew more unpredictable each day. This interplay of ambition and responsibility created a paradox. The very qualities that enabled advancement also increased vulnerability. Influence brought power, but it also drew scrutiny. Discretion minimized exposure, but it could be misinterpreted as hesitation. Every advantage carried potential consequences, and the shadows of ambition were never far away. Eboli's experience during this period highlights a critical truth. Ambition, if unmanaged, creates risk beyond immediate outcomes. It shapes relationships, influences perception, and magnifies consequences. Even careful strategy cannot eliminate the pressures it generates. Awareness, foresight, and discipline become essential tools for navigating its effects. Through observation, calculation, and measured action, Eboli maintained balance. He learned to recognize early signs of unchecked ambition, channeling energy toward collective stability rather than personal gain. This approach preserved his influence while minimizing exposure, a delicate equilibrium that demanded constant attention. Ambition without discipline creates shadows that threaten both achievement and stability. True mastery lies in channeling ambition deliberately, balancing personal goals with responsibility, and recognizing that influence attracts both opportunity and scrutiny. Every decision carries weight, but some weigh more heavily than others. For Thomas Eboli, the accumulation of responsibility over the years had transformed decision-making from a daily task into a profound burden. In his world, a single choice could ripple through multiple layers of operations, affecting not just outcomes, but relationships, loyalty, and survival itself. Decisions in the underworld were rarely simple. They involved multiple variables: human behavior, financial consequences, timing, and perception. A seemingly minor misstep could escalate into a crisis if not anticipated and managed. Eboli understood this better than most. He approached each decision with a combination of analysis, experience, and intuition, aware that errors could carry irreversible consequences. One of the most significant challenges was the unpredictability of people. Human behavior rarely followed logic, and those around him often acted based on emotion, pride, or fear. Eboli had to anticipate not only what people would do, but why they would do it, and how their choices might interact with the choices of others. This mental calculus demanded constant attention and exceptional patience. Financial decisions were equally consequential. Money drove operations, maintained loyalty, and signaled power. Mismanaging funds, even inadvertently, could undermine credibility. Eboli approached every financial arrangement with meticulous care, understanding that the appearance of stability was almost as important as stability itself. Transparency was often impossible, so precision became his shield. Timing was another critical factor. Acting too early could expose vulnerabilities. Acting too late could allow problems to grow uncontrollably. Eboli developed an almost instinctive sense of timing honed through years of observation and experience. Yet, even instinct required confirmation, and he relied on subtle cues: behavior, tone, hesitation to validate the best course of action. The weight of decisions extended to relationships. Every choice affected trust, loyalty, and influence. Eboli recognized that missteps could erode years of careful relationship building. Acting too harshly could breed resentment. Acting too leniently could invite disrespect. Balance became essential, requiring constant adjustment and empathy. Pressure amplified the significance of each choice. Law enforcement activity, shifting alliances, and internal ambition meant that the consequences of error were magnified. Every decision carried both immediate and long-term implications. Eboli's ability to anticipate ripple effects was critical in maintaining stability. Isolation complicated the process. While decisions were informed by experience and observation, they were often made without input from others. Silence, a tool once protective, now amplified the burden. Eboli relied on his own judgment, aware that advice could compromise discretion. This independence strengthened his control but also intensified responsibility. Mistakes were particularly dangerous because of their cascading effects. A single lapse, judgment, whether financial, operational, or relational, could set off a chain reaction. Eboli approached every potential risk as a scenario to be mitigated, weighing each variable against possible outcomes. Planning became multidimensional, considering both direct and indirect consequences. Yet despite careful analysis, uncertainty remained constant. The environment was dynamic, unpredictable, and influenced by factors beyond control. Eboli understood that no decision was ever truly safe, only calculated. Accepting this reality was essential, yet emotionally taxing. The weight of decisions also influenced strategy. Eboli often chose restraint over bold action, recognizing that maintaining stability required patience. Aggressive moves could produce short-term gain but long-term instability. Calculated caution became a defining principle, guiding choices even when immediate opportunities tempted deviation. The personal cost was considerable. Mental fatigue, stress, and constant vigilance became daily companions. Decision-making was never linear. It was a continuous balancing act between competing priorities and pressures. Eboli accepted this burden as inherent to his role, but it shaped his worldview and constrained his flexibility. This period reinforced the paradox of leadership within a precarious system. The more one is relied upon, the greater the weight of every choice. Influence creates opportunity, but it also magnifies responsibility. Decisions become less about personal preference and more about sustaining systems and relationships. Eboli's approach highlights a key principle. Decisions are not only about immediate outcomes, they are about managing consequences, shaping perception, and preserving stability. Success is measured less by individual victories than by the ongoing functionality of the system under one's influence. The true cost of decisions is not measured only in immediate effects, but in the long-term ripple across relationships, trust, and operations. Wisdom comes not from avoidance of risk, but from deliberate calculation, anticipation, and recognition of the weight that each choice carries. Power is seductive. It promises control, influence, and authority, but it always comes with consequences. For Thomas Eboli, The distinction between exercising power and facing its repercussions was never theoretical, it was a daily reality. Every decision, every interaction, every strategic move carried both potential gain and potential cost. Navigating that balance became the defining feature of his life. Eboli understood that power in his world was not absolute. Influence depended on perception, trust, and timing. It could be expanded carefully but could also erode quietly if mismanaged. Thomas Eboli recognized that power attracts attention, and attention invites scrutiny. The more control he exercised, the more others observed, interpreted, and tested him. The first lesson he internalized was that power is as much about restraint as it is about action. Bold moves could consolidate authority, but they could also provoke rivalry, suspicion, or law enforcement interest. Acting decisively required careful consideration of both immediate benefits and long-term repercussions. Impulse had no place in a system where errors multiplied quickly. Managing people was central to maintaining influence. Loyalty was never guaranteed, it was cultivated. Eboli relied on observation, subtle reinforcement, and strategic reward to maintain commitment. Power is more fragile when it depends on fear or coercion alone, and he understood that respect often outweighed intimidation in sustaining authority. Yet the line between authority and consequence was constantly tested. Ambitious subordinates sought recognition. Rivals looked for weakness. External pressures from law enforcement to market changes altered the environment unpredictably. Each action Eboli took had the potential to stabilize or destabilize the system. Miscalculation reverberated quickly. Financial control reinforced power but also introduced additional risk. Funds were both resource and responsibility. Mismanagement could undermine credibility, disrupt operations, or attract scrutiny. Eboli approached financial decisions with precision, knowing that each allocation reflected judgment as much as strategy. A misstep, even minor, could carry consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Timing remained critical. Acting too early could expose vulnerability. Acting too late could allow a problem to grow uncontrollably. Eboli's experience taught him to interpret subtle cues, delays in communication, shifts in behavior, unspoken tension as signals for when to act and when to wait. He learned that the difference between influence and overreach is often measured in seconds, not minutes. Internal consequences were just as significant as external ones. The mental strain of leadership within a high-risk environment was constant. Decisions could not be revisited casually. They carried weight long after they were made. Sleep, once restorative, became fragmented by contemplation of risks, outcomes, and possible reactions. The cognitive load was immense. The paradox of power was clear. Authority provides options, but it also constrains. The higher Eboli rose, the more dependent others became on his judgment, and the more exposed he became to scrutiny. Each decision drew attention, each action had consequences, and each interaction risked revealing vulnerability. Maintaining influence required constant vigilance and relentless self-discipline. Conflict between opportunity and consequence defined nearly every choice. Expanding operations, asserting authority, or challenging rivals could secure short-term gains but increase exposure. Conversely, inaction might protect stability but risk losing ground, respect, or momentum. Eboli had to navigate this tension continuously, balancing ambition with caution. Trust remained central to this balance. Power without trust is brittle. Decisions enforced by fear alone often fail when pressure intensifies. Eboli cultivated loyalty through consistent behavior, fairness, and discretion. But even these measures had limits. Shifting alliances, personal ambition, and external pressures constantly tested the network he had built. Eboli also recognized that consequences extend beyond the individual. Decisions ripple outward, impacting associates, family, and the broader system. The more authority he exercised, the greater the responsibility for the welfare of others. Influence is inseparable from accountability, a principle that shaped every choice. Ultimately, the distinction between power and consequence is inseparable. Every opportunity comes with risk, and every action invites reaction. Eboli's skill was not in avoiding consequences entirely, but in managing them carefully, anticipating outcomes, and mitigating risks wherever possible. The balance required foresight, discipline, and an acute awareness of human behavior. This period of his life reinforced the lesson that power is not a shield, it is a tool. Its effectiveness depends on the wisdom with which it is exercised. Excessive force invites resistance. Excessive caution invites stagnation. Only through careful calibration can influence persist without collapsing under its own weight. Power and consequence are inseparable. Influence brings both opportunity and accountability. Mastery lies not in dominance but in understanding the subtle balance between action and repercussion, recognizing that every choice has both immediate and far-reaching effects. Pressure is rarely visible. It does not announce itself, yet its effects are profound and constant. For Thomas Eboli, the unseen weight of responsibility, expectation, and consequence shaped every decision he made. It was a force that existed in the spaces between action and observation, influencing outcomes long before they became apparent. Eboli had long operated under pressure, but over time it became subtler, more pervasive, and harder to manage. Unlike overt threats or immediate crises, this pressure was intangible. It did not come from a single adversary or situation. It came from the cumulative weight of decisions, relationships, and the expectations of those around him. Thomas Eboli understood that ignoring it would be catastrophic. The unseen nature of pressure made it difficult to mitigate. Unlike financial or operational risks, it could not be quantified or delegated. It required constant vigilance and self-awareness. Every choice, no matter how small, contributed to its growth or alleviation. Eboli learned that failing to act, acting too late, or acting impulsively could all intensify this invisible force. He noticed its effects most clearly in human behavior. Associates, once confident and reliable, became cautious, sometimes overly so. Fear reshaped interactions, even in private moments. People anticipated consequences that had not yet occurred, adjusting behavior in ways that subtly disrupted coordination. Misunderstandings flourished silently, feeding tension and anxiety. Eboli's response was meticulous observation. He tracked changes in tone, timing, and body language. A pause longer than usual, a glance avoided, a hesitation in speech. These minor signals conveyed significant information about the mental state of those around him. In a world governed by subtle cues, recognizing and interpreting them became essential to maintaining stability. Financial matters added another layer of unseen pressure. Maintaining a delicate balance between profit, distribution, and secrecy required precision. Any misstep risked exposure, mistrust, or operational disruption. Each allocation of resources carried both immediate and long-term implications, compounding the invisible weight Eboli bore. The psychological impact of unseen pressure was equally significant. Eboli often faced decisions in isolation without the reassurance of shared perspective. Leadership required that he absorb responsibility silently, shielding his team from the full scope of risk. Over time, this constant mental load intensified stress, fatigue, and vigilance. External factors magnified the effect. Law enforcement, rivals, and shifting alliances created a dynamic environment where the consequences of miscalculation were magnified. Pressure operated quietly, yet its presence shaped every interaction, every strategy, and every contingency plan. Even moments of success did not relieve the weight. Achievements brought attention, expectation, and increased scrutiny. The more influence Eboli exercised, the more pressure accumulated. Every victory contained within it the seed of future risk, reminding him that control is always temporary. Eboli adapted by prioritizing preparation over reaction. Anticipating outcomes, considering multiple scenarios, and rehearsing responses became second nature. Yet this constant anticipation had a cost. Mental bandwidth was consumed continuously, leaving little room for relaxation, reflection, or spontaneity. The burden of foresight was unrelenting. Relationships were shaped by the same invisible weight. Trust had to be maintained carefully, not only through consistency but also by managing perception. Silence, once protective, now had the potential to distort understanding. Eboli recognized that unspoken fears could magnify pressure, so he balanced discretion with strategic communication. Despite all precautions, unseen pressure remained relentless. Its subtle nature meant it could never be fully eliminated. Every operation, conversation, and decision contributed to its presence. The challenge was not to escape it, but to manage it effectively. Eboli learned that success in this environment depended less on elimination of risk and more on endurance, observation, and disciplined response. This period highlighted the paradox of leadership under constant threat. The very skills that create influence, intelligence, foresight, and restraint also amplify pressure. The more capable one becomes, the more responsibility is concentrated, and the more relentless the unseen weight. Eboli's strategy was not to conquer this pressure, but to accommodate it. He distributed responsibility carefully, adjusted engagement based on necessity, and preserved mental and operational equilibrium wherever possible. Awareness, foresight, and measured action became the tools through which he navigated this invisible force. Unseen pressures, unavoidable in environments of responsibility and risk. It is quiet, persistent, and cumulative. Success requires recognition of its presence, discipline management, and strategic adaptation. Endurance, observation, and careful decision-making are more valuable than short-term victories when navigating forces that cannot be directly measured. Loyalty is rarely straightforward. In a world defined by secrecy, shifting alliances, and constant pressure, it is often tested in ways that are invisible to outsiders. For Thomas Eboli, understanding and maintaining loyalty became one of the most crucial and complex aspects of his influence. It was a force that both stabilized and constrained, rewarding discipline while punishing misjudgment. Loyalty, Eboli realized, is built over time. It emerges from consistent behavior, fair treatment, and demonstrated reliability. Those who worked with him learned that his decisions, while measured, were consistent. Promises were kept, guidance was reliable, and discretion was maintained. This created a foundation of trust that was difficult to break, but it was not unshakable. Thomas Eboli knew that loyalty is conditional, fragile, and constantly tested. Pressure from the outside world magnified the fragility of loyalty. Rivals sought to exploit weaknesses, law enforcement applied subtle pressure, and internal ambition created competition. Each interaction had the potential to reinforce allegiance or erode it quietly. Understanding this required constant observation and anticipation of human behavior. Eboli's strategy was subtle. He never forced loyalty through intimidation alone. Fear could compel compliance temporarily, but genuine loyalty required respect and understanding. He observed motivations, rewarded initiative, and intervened discreetly when actions threatened cohesion. This approach encouraged voluntary commitment rather than forced obedience. Yet loyalty is not always transparent. People can act loyal while pursuing personal agendas, and misinterpretation can lead to unnecessary confrontation. Eboli learned to read nuanced tone, hesitation, attention to detail as indicators of true allegiance. These subtleties informed his decisions, allowing him to intervene before minor issues escalated. Financial incentives reinforced loyalty but were not sufficient on their own. Stability, reputation, and perceived fairness played an equal role. Those around him needed to feel secure in their standing, confident that their efforts would be recognized without undue risk. Eboli balanced rewards and responsibilities carefully, maintaining equilibrium between encouragement and caution. Loyalty was further complicated by silence and discretion. Information was compartmentalized to reduce exposure, but this also limited transparency. Misunderstandings could grow in the absence of clear communication. Eboli mitigated this by selective disclosure, providing context and clarity where necessary while maintaining operational security. The shadow of ambition added another layer of complexity. Associates often balanced personal goals against collective responsibility. Eboli had to anticipate how ambition might influence actions and preempt potential conflict. This required not just observation but strategic intervention, ensuring that loyalty aligned with broader objectives without stifling initiative. External scrutiny also tested allegiance. Law enforcement attention, media speculation, and rival observation created pressure that could influence behavior. People acted cautiously, sometimes overcompensating, sometimes withdrawing. Eboli recognized these adjustments and incorporated them into his assessments of loyalty. The personal cost of managing loyalty was significant. Eboli absorbed stress quietly, balancing multiple relationships simultaneously. He had to maintain composure, respond appropriately to challenges, and address subtle issues without disrupting operational stability. Every miscalculation had the potential to destabilize not just a single relationship, but an entire network. Even with careful management, loyalty was never guaranteed. It required constant reinforcement through action, observation, and selective communication. Eboli understood that genuine allegiance is reciprocal. He maintained it through respect, protection, and fairness, and in return, others offered commitment, discretion, and reliability. This period also emphasized the intangible nature of loyalty. It is rarely visible until tested. Moments of crisis reveal true commitment. while consistent behavior in ordinary times builds its foundation. Eboli recognized that long-term stability depended on cultivating these bonds quietly, deliberately, and continuously. The lesson of loyalty in the shadows is profound. Influence depends on relationships, and relationships depend on trust. Maintaining trust requires vigilance, insight, and discipline. Misjudgment can have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment, affecting operations, reputation, and personal safety. Loyalty is cultivated, tested, and maintained quietly. It requires consistency, respect, and awareness of human motivation. True allegiance thrives when reinforced by fairness and observation, and it falters when misjudged, ignored, or manipulated. Leadership is inseparable from the careful management of loyalty, especially in high-pressure, high-stakes environments. Balance is a word often spoken but rarely understood in its entirety. For Thomas Eboli, balance was not a static state, it was a constant negotiation between competing forces, responsibilities, and pressures. Every day demanded careful management of relationships, operations, and perception. One misstep could tip the equilibrium, with consequences rippling far beyond the immediate moment. Eboli understood that balance was fragile. It depended on multiple elements aligning trust, discipline, timing, and judgment. A disruption in any one area could threaten stability. Maintaining this balance required vigilance, foresight, and the ability to anticipate challenges before they became crises. Thomas Eboli recognized that equilibrium was a constant negotiation, not a fixed achievement. The first element of balance was relationships. Alliances were built over years, but could unravel quickly if neglected. Eboli spent significant effort monitoring the subtle dynamics among his associates. He observed behavior, interpreted unspoken cues, and responded to tensions discreetly. Even small signs of dissatisfaction or ambition could indicate potential instability. By addressing these early, he prevented larger disruptions. Financial operations were equally critical. Maintaining profitability while minimizing risk required precise calculation. Eboli ensured resources were allocated strategically, protecting both his influence and the network of loyalty that supported it. Any misstep in resource management could create resentment, mistrust, or operational vulnerability. Balance in finance was both practical and symbolic. It signaled stability and competence. Timing was another cornerstone. Actions taken too quickly could expose vulnerability. Delays could allow problems to grow unchecked. Eboli relied on careful observation to determine when intervention was necessary and when patience was preferable. The ability to assess the right moment was a skill honed through years of experience and acute attention to nuance. External pressure tested the fragile balance constantly. Law enforcement scrutiny, rival activity, and shifting alliances created a dynamic environment where the consequences of miscalculation were magnified. Eboli had to anticipate threats, prepare contingencies, and adjust plans without revealing intent. Each adjustment carried risk, but was necessary to maintain overall stability. The personal cost of balance was profound. Mental and emotional strain accumulated as Eboli navigated conflicting demands. Sleep, often fragmented, offered only partial respite. Constant vigilance, observation, and calculation were required to sustain equilibrium. Every decision, no matter how small, contributed to the overall weight of responsibility. Silence and discretion, once protective, now introduced subtle complications. Limiting communication reduced exposure but sometimes obscured understanding. Misinterpretations could emerge quietly, creating tension that required delicate resolution. Eboli mitigated these risks through selective transparency, ensuring critical information was understood without compromising security. The pressure of maintaining balance also influenced internal strategy. Eboli often prioritized stability over expansion, knowing that growth without control could destabilize the system. Ambition, while a driver of opportunity, had to be carefully moderated. The most effective moves were those that strengthened structure without inviting unnecessary exposure. Cracks in balance often emerged from human factors: fear, ambition, misunderstanding. Eboli monitored subtle indicators: hesitation, tone, body language, and engagement. Each observation informed decisions that preserved cohesion. Balance was as much about human psychology as it was about logistics or strategy. The external perception of balance mattered as well. Appearing stable projected confidence and deterred challenges. Eboli understood that perception influences reality. People often behave in accordance with what they believe is true, not necessarily what is true. Maintaining composure, calmness, and predictability reinforced his authority and preserved trust. Even with careful management, the fragile balance demanded constant adjustment. Environmental changes, personal ambitions, and unforeseen events required responsiveness. Eboli adapted by maintaining a dynamic approach, continuously assessing risk, evaluating priorities, and calibrating actions to preserve stability. This period revealed a universal truth about high-stakes leadership: equilibrium is never guaranteed. It exists only in the ongoing effort to anticipate change, manage relationships, and control perception. The more responsibility one carries, the more delicate the balance becomes, and the greater the cost of misjudgment. Lesson: balance is a dynamic, fragile state requiring constant vigilance, foresight, and adaptability. Stability depends on careful management of relationships, resources, timing, and perception. Leadership is defined not by control alone, but by the skill to maintain equilibrium amidst competing pressures, uncertainty, and human complexity. Legacy is a concept that only becomes visible when the present is heavy with responsibility. For Thomas Eboli, the consideration of what he would leave behind, both an influence and an impact, was ever present, shaping decisions, interactions, and strategy. It was a quiet, invisible pressure intertwined with ambition, loyalty, and the fragile balance he had spent decades maintaining. Eboli understood that legacy is not simply defined by personal achievement. It is measured by the stability and longevity of the systems one creates, by the influence left on people, and by the lessons passed on, whether recognized or not. Thomas Eboli knew that his decisions, while rooted in survival and strategy, were also shaping the framework others would inherit. He often reflected on the dual nature of legacy. On one hand, it was an opportunity, the chance to instill discipline, respect, and structure in a chaotic environment. On the other hand, it was a burden. Every error, misjudgment, or oversight would also be recorded in the memory of those who followed. Every decision, however careful, carried the weight of history. Managing legacy required foresight. Eboli considered not just immediate consequences, but long-term outcomes. Operational decisions, alliances, and financial structures were all evaluated based on how they would influence the network in years to come. Short-term expediency was often sacrificed in favor of sustainable stability. Relationships played a critical role. Loyalty, trust, and discipline were not only tools for present management, they were the threads of continuity that would extend beyond his tenure. Eboli understood that how he treated people, rewarded initiative, and enforced boundaries would leave an imprint, shaping both perception and behavior long after individual circumstances changed. Financial stewardship was equally integral to legacy. Beyond survival, resources needed to be managed in ways that reinforced stability and reliability. Eboli prioritized transparency where feasible, precision in execution, and the equitable distribution of opportunity. Mismanagement or favoritism could undermine not just influence, but also the culture and norms that would endure beyond his immediate control. Ambition, both his own and that of those around him, was a variable he had to manage carefully. Unchecked ambition can erode the structures of influence over time, leaving behind instability. Eboli sought to channel ambition toward collective benefit, encouraging initiative while maintaining order. Guiding ambition became a cornerstone of cultivating a lasting legacy. The weight of legacy also influenced perception. Eboli understood that public image, reputation, and subtle cues of authority would shape how others interpreted his actions. Perception does not exist independently, it reinforces or undermines reality. A legacy built on trust, competence, and calm authority is preserved. One built on fear or impulsive action is fragile. Time itself was a critical factor. Eboli was aware that legacy cannot be rushed. It grows gradually through consistent behavior, careful judgment, and thoughtful intervention. Decisions made in haste, even when seemingly effective, could have long-lasting negative repercussions. Patience, therefore, became both strategy and principle. Isolation intensified the awareness of legacy. As fewer people shared responsibility for decision-making, the impact of Eboli's judgment on the network became more concentrated. Every choice carried amplified significance. Errors could cascade, successes reinforced structure. The responsibility to maintain stability and guide influence rested squarely on his shoulders. External forces also shaped legacy. Rival factions, law enforcement attention, and societal change all introduced uncertainty. Eboli incorporated these variables into planning, ensuring that the systems he maintained were resilient against disruption. Flexibility became essential to ensure that his influence would survive even when circumstances shifted. At a personal level, legacy required introspection. Beyond strategy and operations, Eboli considered ethical and relational dimensions. How would his actions be remembered by those who depended on him? How would the structures he created influence behavior and outcomes in the long term? These questions informed decision-making, adding depth and intentionality to every choice. Even as he navigated present challenges, Eboli was acutely aware that legacy is measured retrospectively. The true impact of leadership, influence, and decision-making is often invisible until long after decisions are implemented. This understanding shaped both restraint and ambition, guiding him to act deliberately rather than impulsively. Ultimately, legacy is inseparable from responsibility. Every decision, every interaction, and every structural adjustment contributes to the enduring influence one leaves behind. Eboli's careful observation, disciplined management, and strategic foresight were not only tools for survival, they were instruments of continuity, ensuring that his impact would extend beyond the immediate moment. Legacy is built quietly through discipline, foresight, and intentional action. It is shaped by relationships, systems, and decisions that outlast the individual. True influence is measured not by immediate gain, but by the stability, respect, and resilience that persists long after one's direct control has ended. Every life, no matter how calculated, is ultimately measured by the sum of its choices. For Thomas Eboli, the final phase of his journey was defined not by sudden events, but by reflection, evaluation, and the ultimate consequences of decades of careful management. The culmination of influence, loyalty, pressure, and legacy formed a lens through which every action, relationship, and decision was seen with clarity. Eboli understood that true assessment of a life in leadership is not about dramatic moments but about consistency under pressure. It is measured in the ability to maintain composure when stakes are high, to make decisions when consequences are uncertain, and to navigate a world where every misstep carries weight far beyond the immediate. This final measure was less about survival and more about endurance, foresight, and integrity within a complex system. By this point, Eboli had experienced the full spectrum of challenges. He had seen loyalty tested, power questioned, and ambition collide with necessity. He had navigated the invisible pressures that shape human behavior, weighed the implications of every choice, and balanced competing demands in an environment where stability is never guaranteed. The final measure was how all of these factors coalesced into a coherent reflection of influence. Human relationships remained central. Eboli's careful cultivation of trust, respect, and loyalty had created a network that could withstand uncertainty. Yet even now, the fragility of those bonds was evident. Ambition, fear, and misunderstanding continued to test allegiances. He recognized that the strength of relationships is only revealed under stress, and that influence is preserved not by authority alone, but by the respect and trust one earns over time. Financial and operational stewardship continued to be critical. Eboli's meticulous attention to detail ensured that systems remained resilient, resources were managed prudently, and the network retained its cohesion. Every allocation, transaction, and adjustment carried long-term implications. Stability in the final measure is not accidental, it is constructed through decades of consistent, deliberate management. The weight of unseen pressure was also ever present. Even after decades, the environment remained dynamic and unpredictable. External forces, rivalries, surveillance, and changing societal conditions continued to challenge assumptions. Eboli had learned to embrace pressure as a constant companion, recognizing that enduring influence requires adaptability and disciplined observation. Legacy became a defining concern. Eboli understood that the culmination of his efforts would be evaluated by the systems he left intact, the stability of relationships he nurtured, and the wisdom embedded in the network he shaped. Influence is measured not only by immediate control, but by the resilience of structures, trust, and norms that persist after the individual is no longer present. Ethics, though rarely visible to outsiders, were a subtle but essential element of the final measure. Decisions that maintained stability, protected lives, and minimized unnecessary harm were markers of enduring influence. Leadership without accountability, even in the shadows, leaves only temporary authority. Eboli's awareness of moral consequence shaped choices that would leave a sustainable imprint, rather than a fleeting footprint of power. Timing remained critical until the very end, knowing when to act, when to intervene, and when to step back defined the difference between lasting influence and exposure to disruption. Eboli's skill in reading the environment, interpreting behavior, and aligning action with principle allowed him to navigate challenges without unnecessary escalation. Timing, precision, and awareness were the final measures of his mastery. Reflection became more prominent as he considered the arc of his life. Success, while notable, was inseparable from cost, mental strain, pressure, and personal sacrifice. Influence comes with responsibility, and the final measure is understanding the breadth of that responsibility. Eboli recognized that leadership is never free of consequence. It is defined by how one responds to the inevitable challenges that arise. Even in moments of uncertainty, Eboli maintained composure. Composure is a measure of endurance as much as strategy. Those who observed him saw steadiness, calm, and authority. But the internal weight, the accumulation of decisions, foresight, and vigilance was immense. The final measure is rarely public. It exists in the sustained application of discipline under conditions of constant unpredictability. The culmination of his experience revealed a fundamental truth. Influence is inseparable from responsibility, and leadership is inseparable from consequence. The systems he maintained, the relationships he nurtured, and the principles he adhered to formed the sum of his enduring impact. Authority without foresight, loyalty without consistency, and power without restraint leave no lasting imprint. Eboli's final reflection focused on what his journey taught, that success is less about dominance and more about stewardship, less about visibility and more about enduring impact, less about short-term gain and more about sustainable influence. True mastery is measured not by immediate victories, but by the ability to preserve, adapt, and guide through uncertainty. The ultimate measure of a life of influence is the enduring effect of one's decisions, relationships, and stewardship. True leadership is defined not by authority alone, but by the stability, loyalty, and resilience one fosters, even under constant pressure. Legacy is constructed quietly, deliberately, and measured over time, not in moments of spectacle, but in the lasting order and wisdom left behind. Thomas Eboli's life was a study in contrasts, discipline amidst chaos, influence without spectacle, and authority balanced delicately against consequence. In a world where impulsive actions often dictated survival, Eboli stood apart. His legacy was not defined by public showdowns or notorious violence, but by the quiet, methodical way he navigated the dangerous currents of New York's Mafia Underworld. To understand the true weight of his life, one must look beyond the headlines and into the shadows where decisions were made, loyalty was tested, and the consequences of power were silently recorded. Eboli's steady hand was more than a reputation, it was a skill honed through years of observation, calculation, and experience. He understood the invisible forces that drive human behavior: ambition, fear, pride, and desire. Each person within his network represented both a potential asset and a latent threat. And managing that dynamic required acute awareness. He learned to anticipate reactions before they occurred, to interpret subtle cues of hesitation or intent, and to act in ways that preserved stability without drawing unnecessary attention. In the underworld, this subtle mastery was more powerful than any weapon. What made Eboli extraordinary was his approach to risk. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he avoided impulsive action. He calculated, observed, and allowed situations to develop until the moment of maximum effect. This patience often contrasted sharply with the brashness of others who sought quick gains or recognition. While some rose rapidly through bold acts, they frequently fell just as quickly when the weight of consequence caught up. Eboli, in contrast, cultivated longevity by valuing restraint, foresight, and the careful orchestration of influence. The backbone of his life was loyalty, not only loyalty he received, but the loyalty he nurtured. He understood that power is fragile when unreciprocated, and that trust, once broken, can unravel years of careful management. His methods were subtle: recognition of effort, strategic reward, selective transparency, and quiet correction when mistakes threatened cohesion. Fear alone was insufficient. Respect, consistency, and fairness were the threads that bound his network together. In essence, loyalty under Eboli's guidance was cultivated, not commanded. Financial management played a similarly critical role. Money was more than currency, it was a tool of influence, a measure of stability, and a reflection of competence. Eboli ensured that resources were distributed in a way that reinforced trust, incentivized cooperation, and minimized exposure to risk. Every transaction carried significance, every allocation reflected judgment, and every oversight had the potential to destabilize the delicate equilibrium he maintained. Precision in finance was inseparable from the maintenance of power, yet the weight of responsibility extended far beyond operations and money. Leadership in Eboli's world carried a constant, invisible pressure that accumulated with each decision, each interaction, and each ripple of consequence. Unlike overt threats, this pressure was subtle, shaping behavior quietly and relentlessly. It was present in the hesitation of associates, the ambition simmering beneath the surface, and the ever-present scrutiny of rivals and law enforcement. Managing this pressure demanded mental resilience, patience, and unwavering attention to detail. One of the defining features of his influence was the careful balancing of power and consequence. Every action he took was weighed not only against immediate gain, but also against long-term impact. Aggressive moves could consolidate control, but risk destabilizing relationships or attracting scrutiny. Hesitation could preserve stability, but allowed rivals or ambition-driven subordinates to gain ground. Eboli navigated this constant tension with a precision that few could match. It was not power for its own sake, it was power exercised with awareness, discipline, and foresight. Eboli's life also illustrates the invisible cost of leadership. While others may have seen the glimmer of influence and wealth, few appreciated the mental and emotional toll it exacted. Sleep was fractured, decisions carried amplified weight, and the margin for error was perpetually slim. He bore responsibility not just for outcomes, but for the well-being of those who depended on him, the integrity of systems he maintained, and the subtle perceptions that shaped loyalty and trust. Influence Eboli understood is inseparable from accountability. Ambition, both his own and that of those around him, was a constant variable to manage. He understood that unchecked ambition could fracture networks and destabilize carefully nurtured relationships. Rather than suppress ambition outright, he channeled it strategically, allowing initiative when it reinforced structure and intervening discreetly when it threatened cohesion. In this way, Eboli transformed potential instability into a tool for stability, reinforcing loyalty while managing risk. Timing, often underestimated by outsiders, was another key to his mastery. Acting too early could reveal vulnerability. Acting too late could allow problems to escalate uncontrollably. Eboli honed an instinctive sense of when intervention was necessary, informed by subtle cues and deep observation. In his world, seconds mattered. Hesitation could erode influence just as decisively as reckless action. The ability to synchronize decision with circumstance became one of his most formidable tools. Perhaps the most fascinating element of Eboli's story is his relationship with legacy. He understood that influence is transient, but the systems, loyalty, and structures he nurtured could endure. His focus was not on notoriety, but on building a framework that could outlast him, a framework where trust, discipline, and foresight created continuity. In this way, his life offers lessons. Beyond the underworld, the importance of planning for the long term, managing relationships with care, and understanding that true influence is measured by durability, not visibility. Eboli's world was also defined by its unpredictability. Rival factions, law enforcement, and the pressures of human behavior meant that certainty was never attainable. Yet this uncertainty was precisely what highlighted his mastery. Where others were reactive, he remained proactive. Where others were impulsive, he remained measured. Eboli's life demonstrates that enduring influence is forged not in moments of triumph alone, but in the consistent management of unpredictability, risk, and consequence. Another aspect of his life that remains instructive is the moral complexity inherent in leadership under duress. While operating within a criminal framework, Eboli consistently displayed a level of restraint and discipline that minimized unnecessary chaos. His focus was rarely on spectacle, it was on stability, survival, and long-term stewardship. In this way, his story offers profound insight into how power, regardless of context, must be tempered with foresight and responsibility. As we reflect on Thomas Eboli's journey, one truth becomes clear: leadership is as much about endurance as it is about action. The visible outcomes, the alliances, the influence, The operations are only part of the picture. The unseen labor, the quiet calculations, and the management of human behavior constitute the core of enduring impact. Eboli's story exemplifies how consistent discipline, observation, and strategic foresight can shape outcomes far beyond the immediate moment. For modern viewers, the lessons are striking. While Eboli's world was criminal, the principles underlying his life discipline, foresight, loyalty, risk management, and the careful balance of power and consequence are universal. They apply to leadership, business, personal relationships, and the management of complex systems. His life serves as a cautionary tale, highlighting both the allure and cost of influence, while offering guidance on how careful observation, patience, and responsibility can create enduring outcomes. Finally, what sets Thomas Eboli apart is his ability to operate in the shadows while exerting profound influence. He demonstrates that true power is rarely loud or aggressive. It is quiet, deliberate, and anchored in understanding the human, social, and structural dynamics at play. Influence exercised recklessly is temporary, but influence exercised with discipline can endure far longer than the individual who wields it. Closing reflection. Thomas Eboli's life is a testament to the intricate interplay of power, responsibility, and consequence. It is a story of a man who mastered the delicate art of influence in a world where errors are amplified, loyalty is fragile, and the unseen pressures of leadership are relentless. His journey teaches that true mastery is not about visibility or notoriety, but about endurance, foresight, and the careful cultivation of systems and relationships. In the end, the most enduring legacy is not the fear inspired, or the wealth accumulated, or even the authority exercised. It is the quiet wisdom, discipline, and resilience that guide both decisions and relationships. Eboli's story is a reflection on the nature of human behavior, the consequences of choice, and the profound responsibility that accompanies influence. And for those watching today, the ultimate lesson is clear. Power is not merely what you hold, but how you wield it. Influence is not measured by recognition, but by stability and resilience. And true leadership, whether in life, business, or history, is forged in the quiet mastery of human dynamics and consequence. Thomas Eboli's steady hand may now be history, but the lessons of his life remain timeless, a cautionary yet instructive guide to understanding the forces of influence, responsibility, and the fragile balance of human ambition.